I've definitely had clients come to me who sought, treatment for sexual abuse before, and they were told that they put on these pounds to keep themselves safe and not be attractive to men or the other sex. And I'm wondering, I know you've done some research on this. Can you speak to this idea a bit?
Yeah, thank you. I started hearing that early in my career, working with people that had binge eating disorder. I noticed a pattern. A lot of people said, I was told by my therapist that I gained weight, as a protective measure against future re-victimization following childhood sexual abuse. And the first time I heard it, I was like, wow, these psychodynamic psychologists, they've got some really creative ways of, connecting some dots. And, I was impressed. And then I heard it again and again and again. And finally, in one case, I kind of leaned into someone. I was like, do you believe that that's true? And they sort of scratched their head and they're like, I don't know. And then I realized, and when you become scholarly, one of the things that I've really enjoyed is like when there's information out there, you kind of scratch your head and you're like, all right, where does it come from? Right? Like who developed this theory? What's the original paper? What's been like the living experience of this information, and how has it disseminated, the production of knowledge. And so, over the years, I started doing a little digging, and I saw that in the 80s, there were some papers that really described what they call barrier weight. And interestingly, the principal investigator of the ACE study, Folletti, is actually one of the people that sort of kind of pioneered that thought from a non-psychodynamic standpoint. I think what they saw was that in 100, I believe it was all women, people in a weight management program, some people would rapidly gain back weight, beyond what was kind of metabolically or physiologically expected. And they were puzzled by it, why is it that after spending 6 months to lose 30 pounds, why is it that within 2 weeks, some of them gained it all back, right? Like, what's the explanation? And so I think it sort of, led to some hypothesis that maybe some people were uncomfortable at the lower weight, right? And then you have to think about like, well, why might that be, right? And then, they started kind of doing some digging and figuring out that some people felt safer when they were no longer, maybe recognized as, a candidate for a partner, which, part of what I'll say in a minute about our recent paper is going to be that, this assumption that fatness is always unattractive really just perpetuates weight stigma, right? So one of the main arguments that we made in the paper is that this assumption that just because someone's in a larger body means that they're not going to be attractive is not helpful either, okay? And weight stigma is an important conversation. So around the same time in the 80s, the psychodynamics were developing theories around why there was a link between childhood sexual abuse and obesity. And they came up with that kind of similar model. And I do think that that's a good model. We recently, published a paper. It's going to be coming out within a few days called The Limitations to the Protective Measure Theory. And really the main point is that, in the 80s, when they didn't have data on biological embedding of adversity, when they didn't know about the inflammatory cascades and the alterations in the ventral striatum following adversity, they weren't aware of the link between HPA axis dysfunction and weight gain. They were doing the best that they could with the data that they had. They were trying to piece together information and make sense out of the world. They certainly didn't have data on food addiction, right? Fast forward a few decades, there's tons of studies that show that childhood adversity increases addiction like eating. and that, the protective measure theory, while helpful and useful for many decades, is limited at best, right? And so we did a really good job in this paper by making the argument that the processes by which adversity is biologically embedded can set up not only addiction like eating, but set up eating disorders, including those are involving not just binging, but purging and other forms of compensatory behaviors, and substance use disorder. And, my interest is on where those three things cluster: food addiction, substance use disorder, and eating disorders, right? And a lot of people have traits of all three that overlap, or they oscillate between the three over time. And some of those conditions are associated with weight gain, and some of them are associated with weight suppression. So if you take our childhood sexual abuse example, let's say someone is a survivor, and then going back to our original example, and now they're 15, they're night eating and they're binge eating. Let's say that they don't decide that they're going to start exercising or purging. Let's say that they start taking Adderall and they move on to crystal meth. And pretty soon they're injecting cocaine and doing stimulants all day, and their trajectory becomes substance use disorder, right? At no point during their addiction treatment is someone likely to connect the dots to their kind of body dissatisfaction and those underlying drivers, right? So the model that's proposed in this paper looks at childhood sexual abuse as the specific type of trauma, the processes by which that can become biologically embedded, the possibilities of someone then going to food addiction, substance use disorder, eating disorders, either one, two, or all three, and how that can affect weight trajectories over time. A lot of substances lead to weight loss or at least weight suppression. And one of the things that we do know is that efforts to suppress weight through dietary restraint and through excess restriction, whether it be from drugs or really low calorie diets, right, are actually risk factors for weight gain. And the body responds to these things by making adaptations, making food taste more delicious, leading to binge eating and more symptoms of food addiction, et cetera. So yeah, the model looks at obesity as an outcome, but also considers how weight suppression, either deliberately or sort of less deliberately, maybe through drug use or otherwise, can all also be contributors to increased BMIs over time. And then finally, we do make the argument that a therapist or whether it be a psychodynamic or someone that just picked up that theory along the way, telling someone that you're doing this to be unattractive is potentially a way to perpetuate weight stigma, and that's not helpful, and that we can sort of put that one to bed.